Aquila by Andrew Norriss, read by Neil Morrissey. It began when Jeff disappeared. The last words he said were, "Where do you want to go then?" Tom was about to reply that he couldn't really think of anywhere worth going when, without warning, with barely even a sound, the entire wedge of earth and grass on which Jeff had been sitting came away from the side of the hill and slid with astonishing speed down the side of the quarry in front of them. Tom watched in astonishment. Jeff had his rucksack on his lap, a can of drink poised in one hand, and there was scarcely time for the look of surprise to register on his face before the earth hit the bottom of the quarry. There was a rumble like passing thunder, and he disappeared. Tom looked at the place where Jeff had been sitting, then at the path that had been scythed through the undergrowth on the side of the slope, and finally at the dark hole at the bottom of the hollow into which his friend had vanished. The whole thing had taken a little less than 3 seconds. "Jeff?" he called, and the sound of his voice echoed round the countryside. "Jeff? Are you all right?" There was no reply. Tom hesitated. It was one of those times when fast, decisive action was required, but he'd never been good at rapid decisions. He was the sort of boy who needs time to think, quite a lot of time usually, and for anything of real importance, he preferred several days' notice. He could go back and get help, but he knew that would take time, and Jeff might need him now. Alternatively, he could climb down and see what had happened. But if Jeff really was hurt, what could he actually do? Decisions. "Jeff!" he called again. "Can you hear me?" "Ah!" A sudden wail came up from the ground, distorted, muffled, but not encouraging. "Jeff?" called Tom. "What is it?" "Ah!" The cry was followed this time by an odd scrabbling sound. Tom threw off his rucksack, rolled over onto his stomach, and lowered himself over the edge of the quarry. As his feet searched for a foothold, his fingers gripped the grass, but the earth beneath them instantly gave way, and he started to slide. Halfway down, he grabbed a branch to try to slow his rate of descent, but the tree was dead. The wood broke off in his hand, and a moment later he was turning, sliding, tumbling and falling all the way to the bottom before disappearing into the darkness. Winded and blinded, he struggled to his feet. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to the light. He was in a cave. The only sound was of water dripping softly from the roof above, and the rock beneath his feet felt damp and cold. Over to one side, he could just make out his friend sitting on the ground nursing an elbow. "Are you all right?" he asked. Jeff nodded. Tom looked at him carefully. "You're sure?" "Fine." Jeff was recovering his breath. "Absolutely fine." Tom's shoulders relaxed a little, but his grip on the piece of branch he was still holding did not loosen. "So, why the screaming?" "Sorry about that." Jeff smiled a little sheepishly. "I suppose it was seeing him over there." Tom turned round to where Jeff was pointing. Then it was Tom's turn. "Ah!" "Missing?" The deputy headmistress had the sort of voice that can only be developed from years of shouting across playgrounds and playing fields. "Who's missing?" Mr. Urquhart winced. "It's 2 of the Year 7s. They were supposed to be back at 12:30, but they're not here." Mr. Urquhart was understandably worried. This was the first school trip he'd organised, and the Peak District National Park had seemed the ideal place for so many learning experiences. He hadn't banked on losing 2 of the children before they'd even sat down to have lunch. Miss Taylor looked at her watch. It was 12:35. "Boys or girls?" she said. "Boys." Mr. Urquhart hurriedly consulted a list on his clipboard. Jeffrey Reynolds and Thomas Baxter." "Ah." Miss Taylor relaxed, took a can of ginger beer from her briefcase and pulled the ring. "You hadn't given them any written work by any chance, had you?" "Well, they had a worksheet." Mr. Urquhart produced the master copy from his file. "I gave one of these to all their form, but I did emphasize they must be back before lunch, so—" Miss Taylor sat down at one of the picnic tables with her drink. "I shouldn't worry about it. Here." She offered her colleague a sandwich. "Have something to eat." "But the boys—" "The boys'll be fine." She gave him an encouraging smile. "I'll bet anything you like they're sitting somewhere quietly at the moment, doing nothing at all. I know those two." Tom and Jeff sat quietly on the ground, doing nothing. "It's all right," said Jeff. "He's dead. I didn't realise it at first, but he's definitely dead." "Yes," Tom nodded. "I can see that." He wasn't an authority on dead bodies, but he knew that not having any skin, or anything else except bones, really, was not a sign of peak health. Anyway, there was the armour. You see, a skeleton wearing a suit of armour, clutching a sword in the bones of one hand and a shield in the other, you know it's dead. It has to be. Tom just wished it wouldn't keep looking at him like that. "I'd say he was Roman." Jeff got up for a closer look. "I've got a model dressed like that at home." Tom stood up and looked at the hole in the roof through which they'd fallen. It was their only way out of the cave, but it was too high to reach. "We need to try and get out. Any ideas?" Jeff didn't reply. He'd taken the sword from the skeleton, scattering finger bones all over the ground, and was experimentally stabbing with it at the air. "I suppose if we piled some of these rocks into the middle, we might be able to stand on them," said Tom. "Or maybe I could climb onto your shoulders and then—" "Jeff, are you listening?" "Sorry?" Jeff had stopped waving the sword around and was staring into the cave. "I was just wondering what that was." "It's a skeleton." No, I meant that thing, over there." Jeff pointed in a direction slightly to one side and behind the dead body. Tom peered nervously into the darkness. "It's just a rock. They're all rocks. You can—" He stopped. The rock Jeff was pointing to was a different colour to those around it, and had a curiously regular shape. As they walked towards it, they could see that, whatever it was, it certainly wasn't a rock. It was large, smooth, a dull red colour, and shaped rather like a small boat. The front was pointed in a smooth upward curve that reminded Tom of the nose of a dolphin. "It's got writing on it." He leaned forward to brush away the dust with his sleeve. On the upper surface, someone had painted a series of letters in gold, but before he could make out what they were, Jeff called him. "Tom!" There were 2 seats set into the centre of whatever it was, and Jeff was sitting in one of them. He was beckoning to Tom and staring intently in front of him. "What?" Jeff pointed, and Tom came round to look. On the surface in front of the seats, a green light glowed in the dark. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything. It just came on." "It came on?" "I just sat down and it came on." Jeff pointed. "Like that one." A small orange light had appeared beside the green one. A moment later, it was joined by another. And another. Silently, Tom climbed in to sit beside Jeff. They watched as the lights continued to flick on until they extended to cover the whole board in front of them, and then spread along the panel that stretched between them to the floor. At the same time, the boys became aware of a faint humming, an almost inaudible vibration that they felt rather than heard, culminating in a ping that reminded Tom of a microwave oven telling you the pizza was ready. And that was that. Wow. Jeff reached out a hand. Directly in front of him were 2 horizontal handles, and between them a circle of 4 large blue lights arranged like the petals of a flower. "I wonder what it is." Tom shrugged. "Well, it's a machine." "Yes, but what's it for?" Jeff ran a finger cautiously over the surface of one of the lights. "I wonder if we could find out." "What are you doing?" "They're not just lights, are they?" Leaning forward, Jeff stared intently at the surface under his hand. "They're buttons, you see. I reckon if you pushed one of these—" "You can't do that!" Tom stared in horror at his friend. "You don't know what'll happen." Jeff said nothing. Obviously they didn't know what would happen. It was why he wanted to push a button and find out. His finger still hovered over the group of blue lights. "At least let's think about it first," pleaded Tom. "Think about it? Just for a minute or 2. It might help." Reluctantly, Jeff sat back and thought about it. But the more he thought, the more it struck him that you could think forever and still not know anything. There was only one way to really know. "I'll try this one." He reached out and stabbed one of the blue lights firmly with a forefinger. Tom opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, the world disappeared in an explosion of light and noise accompanied by a thin, high-pitched wailing sound, which Tom only slowly realised was his own voice. "Frightened?" Mr. Urquhart said. "You think they're frightened?" "Terrified." Miss Taylor brushed the crumbs off her skirt. "Both of them. It's a straight biological reaction. You mention the possibility of written work and their feet feel this irresistible urge to move in the opposite direction." "I see. It's a form of allergy, really. You know, I've actually seen Tom come out in a rash when someone asked him to write a poem." "I'd no idea." "I should have warned you. It doesn't matter so much in the classroom, of course, but out here, well, they just run away." Miss Taylor paused for a moment to tell a child half a mile away to stop picking its nose. "What have you got planned for their group this afternoon?" Mr. Urquhart picked up his file. "At 1:30 I was taking them up to see the hall." "That's when they'll turn up. 1:30. Miss Taylor took a bite out of her third pork pie. "They'll have some story about losing the worksheet in a gale, chasing after it, getting lost. Little blighters." She patted Mr. Urquhart on the knee. "The important thing is not to spoil your lunch bothering about it." When Tom stopped screaming, he realised the main reason it was still dark was that he had his eyes closed. He opened them to find everything was white. White light, white mist, white everything. Jeff was still sitting beside him. He'd gone a bit white as well. "Are we still alive?" "I think so." Jeff forced a smile. "I'm still breathing and things." "Where are we?" Jeff hesitated. "Well, I had a look, and we're still sort of in the same place, but up a bit." "Up a bit?" Jeff nodded. "If you look over the side..." Tom looked over the side and immediately wished he hadn't. The ground was still there, but a very long way away. Between the clouds he could see the vast pattern of fields, trees, a river winding through the valley. He hurriedly closed his eyes again. "I reckon it's about half a mile," said Jeff. "But it's okay. I know what to do." He reached forward. "If that one made us go up, then this one," he pointed to the button underneath it, "should make us go down." Tom gripped Jeff's arm. "Don't touch anything." "We don't have any choice, Tom. Unless you want to stay up here forever." "I know, but I think we should sit here and think about it first, all right? Let's think about it." They sat together in silence for several minutes while Tom thought about it. There was, he eventually decided, only one thing to do if they were ever going to get down. "Okay," he said. "Try it. But slowly, okay? Very slowly." Jeff reached out and gently pushed the button. Several seconds passed. "Is anything happening?" "Yes," said Tom. "We're going backwards." It was very simple once you knew. There were 4 of the blue lights. 2 of them made you go up or down. The other 2 sent you forwards or backwards. The harder you pushed, the faster you went. There was one heart-stopping moment when Jeff grasped the handle in front of him and the whole machine swung over onto its side. The boys hung there for a second and were just starting to topple out when Jeff instinctively reached out to clutch the other handle and, as he did so, the machine righted itself. The handles either side of the blue lights responded to pressure. You pushed them as if you were trying to steer a motorbike, and as you did so, the whole machine swung round. Pull them up and you pointed upwards. Push them down or to the side, and that's where the nose went. The whole thing, Jeff thought, required slightly less skill than riding a tricycle. You gripped the handles, used your thumbs to push the buttons, and off you went. "A child could do this," he said cheerfully, as he swung them down and to the left in a banking curve that would take them through a gap in the clouds. "You think you can get us down?" asked Tom. "No problem." Through the cloud, Jeff turned in a gentle spiral to the right. "That's what I've been saying. Anyone could do this." "If you can get us down," said Tom, "I think you should do it. I think you should do it now." "Okay." Jeff pushed forward. The nose dipped, and a slightly increased pressure from his left thumb sent them sinking towards the earth. As they got closer, he swung briefly to the left to avoid a clump of trees, and they finally came to rest on the edge of a cornfield. He swung round a few times, lifted his hands from the controls, and looked down at the flattened circle of corn beneath them. That should give the farmer something to think about. He turned to Tom. "How are you feeling?" Tom was already scrambling out of his seat. He had never quite realized before what a wonderful thing it was to stand, simply to stand on firm ground. It would be even better when his knees had stopped shaking. Jeff climbed out to stand beside him. It was his first chance to get a proper look at the machine that had catapulted them so extraordinarily into the air, and the first thing he noticed was that it wasn't actually on the ground, but hovering motionless a few inches above the flattened corn. It hadn't moved so much as a millimetre as he and Tom had climbed out, not even a tremor, and although it hung in midair, it somehow gave the impression of being more solidly positioned there than the ground beneath it. The letters Tom had noticed painted on the front were now clearly visible. The gold was faded and peeling, but still legible. "What does it say?" Tom came round to look. "Aquila," he read. Aquila? It was a good name, Jeff decided. "You think it's Roman?" "What?" "The man in the cave was Roman. I suppose this must be as well." "I don't see how it could be." Tom frowned. "Romans didn't have flying machines, did they?" Jeff tried to remember. They had done the Romans with Miss Spatchel in Year 6. He didn't recall her saying anything about flying, but it might have been a lesson he'd missed. "Do you think it's newer than that?" He gazed doubtfully at the machine. "It doesn't look new. Looks more sort of old. Very old." Without knowing why, Tom had to agree. He stepped forward to finger a dent at the back where a large corner of one metal fin was twisted and discoloured. "Did we do that?" Jeff shook his head. "It was like that when we got it. Come on." He swung a foot onto the side wing of Aquila and pulled himself up and back into the seat. "I vote we tell Mr. Urquhart it all started when his worksheet blew away in a gale, and we'll say we were chasing it when—" "What's the matter?" Tom stared at him. "What are you doing?" "We have to get back." Jeff settled in his seat. "We've missed lunch already." "You're going to fly there?" "Why not?" Jeff grinned. "Oh boy, their faces when they see this." Tom hesitated. "Come on," said Jeff. "It'll be fun." "Yeah." Tom stepped slowly up to Aquila. "Fun." "Right," said Miss Taylor. "Where exactly were they supposed to go?" Mr. Urquhart pointed to the map attached to his master worksheet. "Along here, the route marked in green. It was an exercise in map reading, you see, and they had to—" "If you sent them that way, they've probably gone over here." Miss Taylor pointed in the opposite direction. "What's all this?" "That's a quarry." "A quarry?" said Miss Taylor. "And some old lead mines." Mr. Urquhart swallowed nervously. "And caves. There's a lot of caves round here. It's what makes it such an interesting area geographically." "Perfect." Grimly, Miss Taylor stood up and turned to face the children. "Now listen up, everybody. Pay attention, please." All heads turned in her direction, including a party of old-age pensioners on the far side of the picnic area who guiltily put down their cups of tea and stopped talking. "You probably all know by now that we've got 2 people missing," said Miss Taylor. "I'm going off to find them and bring them back. I just want to make it clear that if anyone else is foolish enough to get lost this afternoon, they will be travelling back to school with their feet tied to the back axle of the coach. Understood?" "All right, carry on." "You don't think they've had an accident, do you?" asked Mr. Urquhart. Miss Taylor picked up her map. "They will have when I get to them." And she strode off, stony-faced, into the trees. The flight back to the quarry was not as bad as Tom had expected. They travelled at a few metres above the ground, which was a lot less frightening than being several thousand metres in the air, and he had to concede it was the most extraordinary sensation. It was like being a bird, but without all the bother of remembering to flap your wings. Aquila sailed over the ground with less effort than it took to push a telephone button, and in total silence. A couple of cows gazed indifferently up at them as they crossed one field, and a flock of sheep ran away from their shadow in the next. They waved at a couple of cyclists when they flew over a road and laughed as one of them fell off his bike in surprise. And when, finally, they swept over the top of the hill behind the quarry they had left so suddenly an hour before, Tom decided that before they went back to the coach, he would like to try a turn at the steering himself. It was such an incredible machine. It was a shame, in a way, he added, that they wouldn't be able to keep it. "What do you mean?" Jeff leant over the side to pick up Tom's rucksack from the quarry's edge. "Why shouldn't we keep it?" "Well, we can't, can we?" It was so obvious that Tom found the reason difficult to put into words. "For a start, it's not ours." "Yes, it is. We found it." "That doesn't mean it belongs to us." "We know who it belongs to," said Jeff. He pointed to the bottom of the quarry. "He's down there, and he doesn't want it anymore." "That doesn't make any difference." Tom looked at his friend. "Come on, Jeff. Your mum doesn't let you ride a bike on the main road. You think she'll let you buzz around town in something like this? You think anyone will?" They were hovering directly over the cave. Beneath them, the Roman soldier stared out in front of him, as he had for the last millennium and a half. "So when we get back," said Jeff, "we just hand it over and never see it again?" "I wouldn't have thought so." "They'll take it away?" "Yes." "We'll never have another chance to fly it?" "No," said Tom. "Or find out what any of these other buttons do?" "No." There was a long pause as an idea slowly grew in Jeff's mind. A very simple idea. "I have a suggestion," he said. Miss Taylor strode up to the hall with the thunderclouds almost visible above her head. She had spent the last 40 minutes fruitlessly walking and calling through the woods, and was in the mood to pull the arms off any child who dared so much as talk back to her. "They're here!" Mr. Urquhart came down the path to meet her. "Back 10 minutes ago." "Right!" Miss Taylor's eyes narrowed. "I want 2 ritual disemboweling knives and a sharpening stone." "I think I ought to warn you, they could both be in shock," said Mr. Urquhart. "They've been through a very traumatic experience." "It's nothing to the experience they're going to have when I—" Miss Taylor stopped. "Why? What happened?" "They found a body. A dead body." Mr. Urquhart shook his head. "I'm just hoping it doesn't leave them emotionally scarred." Miss Taylor looked up the hill to where the 2 boys were surrounded by an eager group of classmates. Tom was holding a skull, and Jeff was moving the lower jaw like a ventriloquist dummy to make it tell a knock-knock joke. She walked briskly towards them, scattering small children on either side like leaves. "Give me that," said Miss Taylor. She held out a hand. As Jeff passed the skull across to her, a large spider crawled out of one of the eye sockets, and one of the Year 9s fainted. "Pick her up, somebody!" Miss Taylor sighed and turned to Mr. Urquhart. "Call the police, will you, Graham?" "And you," she turned back to the boys, "had better show me where you found this." It was astonishing, Jeff thought, how many people you needed just to decide what to do with a few bones. At the moment, he could count at least 14 vehicles and more than 30 people, not including himself, Tom, or Miss Taylor, gathered at the base of the quarry. There were 4 policemen in 2 police cars, an ambulance with a nurse and 2 paramedics, a doctor and his wife, and a Land Rover and 2 cars containing the 5-man team that had come out from the county archaeology department. Another Land Rover belonged to the farmer who owned the land. Then there was a van belonging to a representative of the local Wildlife Protection Society, and a Mini that had somehow contained 6 large men from the cave rescue services. The woman in charge of the archaeological team had short cropped hair and a silver ring in her nose, and was called Dr. Warner. She climbed out of the cave, brushing the worst of the dirt from clothes that had not been particularly clean when she went down. "Definitely Roman," she announced. "Probably late 3rd or early 4th century. It's difficult to tell at this stage, but he's been there at least 1,500 years. Any idea how he died? Asked someone. Dr. Warner shook her head. Not really, she said. There are 15 empty jars of Cypriot wine down there that might have something to do with it. Or he could have been poisoned by someone from the Free Britain movement. She paused. He was sealed in there when the roof of the cave collapsed, but that could have happened at any time. So you don't know why he was down there? Asked Jeff. No. The archaeologist looked thoughtfully back down at the body. He's a long way from the cave entrance, though, and in full armour. It's curious. Romans didn't have machines, did they? Tom blushed as everyone turned to look at him. I just wondered how he carried all the wine down there. Miss Taylor watched as Dr. Warner explained to Tom how Roman society was powered by slaves rather than technology, and felt a faint doubt stir in her mind. There was something not quite right in all this. She couldn't quite put her finger on what it was, but something about the way those boys were behaving didn't fit. They're asking questions, aren't they? Said Mr. Urquhart, standing beside her. What? The archaeologist. They're asking her things. They don't usually do that, do they? Miss Taylor suddenly realised he was right. Tom and Jeff never asked questions. Questions got you noticed, and they had both spent years perfecting the technique of sitting at the back of a class attracting as little attention as possible. Attention might mean you had to do some work. It's like they're, well, interested, said Mr. Urquhart. I've never seen them like that before. No, said Miss Taylor thoughtfully. Neither have I. As the school coach left the National Trust car park, Tom and Jeff sat together in seats near the back. Tom had the map from his worksheet spread out on his lap, and the two boys gazed intently out of the window as the coach turned out onto the road that would take them back to Staveley. Mr. Urquhart, sitting in the front, caught a glimpse of them in the rear-view mirror and considered, not for the first time, what an odd pair they made. They were such different boys, in the way they looked as much as the way they behaved, and yet he knew that in school and out they were virtually inseparable. It was, most people agreed, a curious friendship. He would have been even more puzzled if he'd known what the boys were doing. Neither of them spoke as the coach set off down the road, but both stared intently out of the window at an isolated barn just visible at the top of the hill on their right. It was a very ordinary barn, with open sides, of the sort farmers used to store bales of straw through the winter, but its location had been carefully marked on Tom's map. If Mr. Urquhart had seen it, he would have been impressed at the care that had been taken to note its exact position, and the way the boys now double-checked to make certain that there had been no mistake. Tom and Jeff wanted to be quite sure they could find it again when they came back. As I see it, said Jeff, pushing open the doors to the school library, we have two real problems. First, we have to get out there so we can fly it back, and second, we have to have somewhere ready to hide it when we do. As he followed his friend over to the desk, Tom privately thought they could have a good many more than two problems, but he said nothing. There seemed to be quite enough difficulties connected with the ones Jeff had mentioned. Mr. Urquhart was on duty at the desk, signing out the books people wanted to borrow, and he looked up at the boys in some surprise. He'd never seen Tom or Jeff in the library before, and if what Miss Taylor had told him was true, there was some doubt whether either of them could read. "Have you got any maps?" asked Jeff. "Maps?" Mr. Urquhart carefully disguised his surprise and stood up. "I think we might be able to help," he said, "if you'd like to follow me." And he led the way over to the reference section. When he came back to the desk, Miss Taylor was waiting for him. "What are those two doing in here?" She had lowered her voice until it sounded no louder than the rumble of passing lorries, and was staring suspiciously at Tom and Jeff. "They wanted a map of our route yesterday," explained Mr. Urquhart. "I'm not sure, but I think they may be planning to go back." "You mean to the cave?" said Miss Taylor. "Yes, it's rather encouraging, isn't it?" Mr. Urquhart smiled happily at the boys who were busily thumbing through the road guide to Britain he'd given them. It really seems to have caught their imagination. Miss Taylor did not reply. Through narrowed eyes, she continued to stare at the boys. "I wonder why they go around together all the time," said Mr. Urquhart. I mean, as far as I can see, they've got nothing in common at all. "Are you doing anything on Saturday?" asked Miss Taylor. "I'm sorry?" Mr. Urquhart blinked. "Saturday," repeated Miss Taylor. "Didn't you say you had to go back out to the park sometime to make sure the next field trip wasn't anywhere near a quarry?" Yes," said Mr. Urquhart. "Well, I thought that sometime I should—" "If you went there on Saturday," said Miss Taylor, "you could take the boys with you, couldn't you? Keep an eye on them, maybe find out what's going on." "You think they're up to something?" asked Mr. Urquhart. "I know they're up to something," said Miss Taylor. "I just want to know what it is." She paused for a moment to confiscate a Walkman from a passing 16-year-old. "And you're quite wrong." Mr. Urquhart didn't always find it easy to keep track of conversations with Miss Taylor. "About them." The deputy head nodded towards Tom and Jeff. "They do have one thing in common." "They do?" "They both come bottom of the class. Always have done, ever since primary school." Miss Taylor landed a meaty hand on Mr. Urquhart's shoulder. "Take my word, it can be a very powerful bond." Tom carefully measured the distance with his ruler, but it only confirmed what he already suspected. "It's not going to work," he said. "It's too far." According to the map, it was nearly 50 miles from Staveley to the barn where they'd left Aquila. They would never be able to cycle that far in an afternoon. "So, we have to think of something else." Jeff sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "There isn't anything else," said Tom. "That's it. We've tried everything." He had a point. Cycling had not been the first possibility on their list. The evening before, Jeff had asked his parents if they could drive him out, but the answer had been no. Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds ran a newsagent's that was open 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they simply didn't have the time. Tom's mother was in no position to help either. Mrs. Baxter suffered from an illness called agoraphobia, which meant she was frightened of open spaces and couldn't go out of doors. Jeff had rung the railway station, but trains do not run in national parks, and the man at the bus depot had told him that no buses went within 5 miles of where they wanted to go. Cycling had been the only idea they had left. Jeff was still trying to come up with an alternative when he looked up to see Mr. Urquhart standing at the end of the table. "I don't know if it's of any interest," said the teacher, "but I'm going back out to the national park on Saturday, and if either of you wanted to come with me—" He stopped, a little unnerved at the way the boys seemed to be staring at him. "It's not compulsory or anything," he added. "It was just, if you were interested." "I think we might be interested," said Jeff. He smiled triumphantly as Mr. Urquhart walked back to his desk. "There you are. Problem solved." Tom pointed out that there was still one difficulty. "He'll know, won't he?" "What?" said Jeff. "Mr. Urquhart. If he takes us out to the site, he'll expect to take us back." "So?" "But if we've flown home with Aquila, we won't be there for him to take back, will we? So he'll know something's happened, won't he?" Jeff thought about it. Tom was right. Could be a tricky one, that. Jeff worried about the problem all afternoon. He thought about it through Miss Poulson's history lesson on the causes of the First World War, and then through Mr. Duncan's double maths. Nothing that either teacher said disturbed his train of thought, and finally, on the way home, the answer came to him. It was a clever idea, and if Miss Poulson or Mr. Duncan had heard it, they would have found it hard to believe that Jeff was its author. "Supposing only one of us went with Mr. Urquhart on Saturday," he suggested, as they turned into the street where Tom lived, "and the other one stayed here." Tom grunted. He was looking at a stone he had found in the road just outside the school gates. He couldn't be certain till he got it home, but he was pretty sure it was a piece of fluorite. "Then at lunchtime, the one of us out there could say he wants to go for a walk, go up to the barn, get Aquila, and fly it back here." If it was fluorite, thought Tom, it was remarkably pure. The crystal was almost colourless. "Then, whoever's back here gets in it, we both fly out to the site, whoever was out there before gets out, and whoever was back here flies it back. You see? We'll both be back where we're supposed to be, and Aquila will be in there." Jeff pointed to the garage at the top of Tom's drive. "It's the perfect place to hide it. Your mum will never see it. She never goes out." Tom stared at his friend as the idea slowly penetrated his brain. One of them would go out to the site on Saturday with Mr. Urquhart. In the course of the day, that person would fly Aquila back to Staveley, pick up the other one. They would both fly back to the site, and then the one who'd been picked up would fly Aquila back to Staveley. No. Tom shook his head firmly. It wouldn't work. What do you mean it wouldn't work? Said Jeff. Of course it'd work. Why wouldn't it work? Tell me one thing about it that wouldn't work. Jeff looked closely at Tom. You're not frightened, are you? Tom said nothing. I mean, there's nothing to be scared of, is there? Nothing to be scared of? Tom spoke with a sudden and surprising force. How about flying 50 miles in a machine we've only sat in twice that you found in a hole in the ground? Oh, come on. Jeff was slightly taken aback by the vehemence in Tom's voice. It'd be worth it, wouldn't it? He said, to have something like that parked in there. And what if it breaks down? Tom became even more agitated than before. Or if we get lost? Or if I bump into something like a tree or a small hill or a big hill and we kill ourselves? Would it still be worth it? You won't bump into anything, said Jeff, and then remembered that the only time Tom had taken the controls on the way up to the barn, he'd bumped into a wall. I'll explain it all to you, he added. It's really easy. You saw. I learnt in 2 minutes. You learnt to swim in 2 minutes, said Tom. You're that sort of person. I'm the one who had lessons for 2 years and still wears armbands, remember? Jeff stared at his friend. He hadn't seen Tom this determined since the time he'd refused to go on the death slide at the American theme park. Look, all you have to do... No! Tom turned and started walking up the path to the back door. No, I'm sorry, I can't do it. You'll have to work out something else. And before Jeff could reply, Tom had gone into the house and closed the door. In his bedroom that evening, Tom sat at his desk, relabelling his collection of rocks. He had always collected rocks. His mother said it had started when he was 3 and found a tiny fire opal on the beach in the days when they still went on holiday, and he had been collecting ever since. She had no idea why, though privately she suspected that rocks went at about the right speed for Tom. There was something about the pace of life of a lump of granite that suited him. And it was true that Tom always turned to his collection whenever he had a problem or the smooth surface of life became disturbed. He had found there was something soothing in the feel of a piece of agate as you ran it through your fingers, something steadying and calming in the idea that it had been that shape for 4 million years, something quietly reassuring in its patient, glinting stillness. But at the moment, Tom was finding it difficult to concentrate on colour-coding his mineral deposits. Thoughts of Jeff and Aquila filled his mind. A part of him wanted very much to do as Jeff had suggested, and not just because Jeff was his friend. Aquila, he knew, was not the sort of discovery one made every day, and the longer it was left in the barn, the more likely it was that someone else would find it. Jeff's idea would work. It was what Tom wanted to do. It was right. It was what he'd like. But when Jeff had asked Tom if he was frightened, he had not understood his friend at all. Frightened did not begin to describe the stomach-churning, mind-numbing sensation that took over Tom's body at the thought of flying Aquila on his own. He had been trying desperately to think of some other way they might be able to bring it home, but with no success. His mother appeared at the door with a plate of biscuits and a mug of hot chocolate. Mrs. Baxter was a small, nervous woman with a worried look on her face. A lot of things worried Mrs. Baxter, but at the moment she was worrying particularly about Tom. She was worried that she had upset him when she said she could not take him out to see the body of the Roman centurion in his cave. She had been worrying about it all day. "I'm sorry about Saturday," she said, "but you do understand, don't you?" "Yes, of course." Tom picked up his mug. "And it doesn't matter. Mr. Urquhart said he'd take us." "The geography teacher?" Tom nodded. "But I think I've changed my mind anyway. I'm not sure I want to go." Mrs. Baxter looked, if possible, even more worried. "It's my fault, isn't it?" she said. "You'd want to go if it was me taking you, and it's what I ought to be doing. I'm your mother." "I told you it doesn't matter," said Tom. "Really, it's all right." "It's not all right, and it does matter." Mrs. Baxter sniffed and took out a handkerchief. "It's silly not to do something you want to do, that's right to do, that you'd like to do, just because you're too frightened. It's stupid, and it's wrong." She blew her nose sharply. Don't forget to bring your mug down when you've finished." She picked up the empty tray and took it back downstairs. Tom stared at the door for some moments after she'd gone. Then, slowly, he picked up the mobile phone his mother had given him for calling the police in an emergency and dialed a number. Mrs. Reynolds answered. She said Jeff had gone out for a walk, but asked if she could take a message. "If you could tell him," said Tom, "that I've changed my mind and it's okay about Saturday. He'll understand." He put down the phone, then got out an exercise book and his pen and started to write. Carefully, he began to describe exactly what had happened when they found Aquila and how they were planning to bring it home. If he was killed on Saturday, and he was fairly sure that he would be, it seemed only fair that his mother should have a chance of knowing the truth. End of side 1.